And my name is Caitlin Thomas, and I will be the kind of moderator for this discussion. But this is really going to be a discussion. It's not going to be speeches. It's going to be discussion of various issues and various questions on a rather informal roundtable format. So before we begin the discussion, I would like to briefly introduce the various panelists who are going to be here. First of all, we have Zakia Hakki, who is in the middle here, who is the first woman ever to be appointed a judge in the Middle East North Africa region. She was appointed way back in 1959. She founded the Kurdistan Women Foundation, one of the earliest groups in the region dedicated to the advancement of women's rights, as well as democracy, human rights, constitutional reform, and rule of law. And she's a former member of the Iraqi Parliament and a steadfast advocate for the legal protection of women's rights. Then sitting next to her with the blonde hair is Carole Basri, who has been a vocal advocate for human rights in Iraq. And I've had the pleasure of working with her on a number of programs dealing with this issue at the American Bar Association. Manija, am I pronouncing that correctly? Manija Nadiri is the executive director of Women for Afghan Women, which runs legal aid centers, shelters, and other programs for women throughout Afghanistan, as well as a program for the Afghan community in the United States. Those of you who read the New York Times recently will have noted the recent articles describing the work of the WAW in Afghanistan, and they do quite a bit of work. It's quite a fantastic organization, I must add. Then we have Gissou, is it Gissou or Gissou?
You got it first.
Gissou Nia, the Deputy Director of the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran in New York, an NGO dedicated to monitoring and reporting on human rights in Iran. And then we have, back here on this side, R. What does the R stand for, by the way?
Sorry, I had to kill you.
Okay, she says she'll have to kill me if she tells me, so I won't ask her. Yvonne Idahosa, an attorney, founder, and executive director of Pathfinders Justice Initiative, Incorporated, New York, an NGO dedicated to the fight for women's rights throughout the world. Originally from Nigeria, Ms. Idahosa focuses much of her activities on the problems faced by women in that country. And I understand she has just arrived from a trip to that country, so I'm sure that her information will be quite up to date. And we are expecting to be joined by Isohe Agatisi. Is that correct? Agatisi? A Nigerian human rights activist, particularly involved in issues involving the trafficking of girls and women. So that is the list of the speakers for tonight. And as I said, this is going to be a roundtable discussion. And instead of having speeches, I'm going to ask some questions and then ask questions from the audience. And the first question I'm going to ask each one of the panelists is to briefly summarize the current situation with regards to women's rights in their country, and to say whether it has improved or deteriorated recently, and whether the current conflicts and extremism that's permeating the part of the world they live in has had an effect on these rights. So let me start with Zakia, talking about the situation in Iraq, because she has a lot to say. And we also have some film clippings that she sent us about the situation that we can show you. Zakia?
Sorry, I have two artificial knees. I always said I have two brand new knees, not used like you are. So, but it's difficult to have artificial knees. Of course, I survived an assassination attempt. She knows about that while I was in Iraq. I went there back. This is another story. I have now another story, another tragedy. I need first of all, to deliver the unheard voices for all those victims on daily basis. You know, we have this tragedy. It is another Holocaust. It is another genocide against my people. Kurdish people, they are Kurd. The Yazidis, they are Kurd. And as if it was not enough, the genocide that my people faced during Saddam's time. Now we have those murderers, those cannibals, vicious Wahhabis, who they came. I think you heard about this before ISIS, even in Afghanistan, what they did. This is not the first time those murderers committed all these crimes against humanity. These pictures, it is alone, if you look at it, you will see that, especially the last year, it was the worst year in the history of Iraq, especially in Iraq and Syria, for women and young girls. When those murderers, they took control on part of Syria, and they came to Iraq and controlled 3 provinces. Even though they claim that they are Muslim Sunni, they are not Muslim and have never been Muslim. Muslim cannot kill. It is any of these, messages which is from God, cannot allow any criminal to appoint himself as a new God, and he said, I am better than you, so you should be killed, only I have to stay in this life. This is even if we don't believe in any religion. What is the wrong with that? It is something very personal for anyone to choose to be Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhism, any or without any religion. So those murderers, they came for hundreds of thousands. Now about 3 million Iraqis have fled their countries, their places, their towns, their villages, from northern part of Iraq to the southern and to the middle of Baghdad and other provinces. If we can see these pictures, look, this is the map of Iraq, and the area of Mosul, which is the top, the northern part, and they came to the places that we have oil. Where we have oil, the other picture, my dear, the other after that. Okay, look, everywhere. This is what they occupied three provinces. Okay, and they are selling. There is some other countries who enable them to sell our oil and to have money. Look at their uniforms. Look at their brand new convoys, those cars, 2014, and who support them? We need to know. I think all of you can guess who is behind all these crimes. What happened? Look, this area of Iraq and the other one from Syria, they control it. If you see there is, I don't know if you allow me to, because I send it to you. We have to see, not like ostrich, we have to talk openness. We should see the crimes that they did. I need all of you to join me to deliver the unheard voices of those victims to all worldwide, to all humanity. Because if today it is happening in Iraq, tomorrow it will happen. And it happened already on September 11 here in America. It's happened also. Look at, I need to see, they brought little kids of Yazidis. If you see, there is a little kid about 3 or 4 years old. They put them, all of them, in a cage. And they have their clothes, a uniform, orange uniform for all of them. From where they brought these, I don't know. So that young little kid brought his two arms outside the bars of the cage. He was looking around. He didn't know that what they are preparing for him while the flame is coming to burn all of them. Can you imagine little kids to be burned alive? Or cut the throat of women, or kidnapped women, abducted them, raped them, then make them slaves with tags on their head. This woman $100, the other $500. You can let them see. Look, those with their let them see a young girl. I am sure she is even less than 18 years old. Little breasts she had. They naked her, put her on a table, and with a knife, one took her chin up, the other one, 2 or 3 men, her 2 hands handcuffed behind her, and while they were cutting her throat, there was just like a saucepan on the earth in order to collect her blood. Well, what kind of are they human? Those vicious criminals. So look at, this is only some, look how they fled. Look at them. Look, those helpless women and children. Look. They killed the men. Men should be killed, all of them. And those who survived, either they should choose being Muslim, they are Muslim, Wahhabis, or if they refuse, they will be either killed or send them to casualties of war to be sold in the market of slave in Raqqa. Raqqa in Syria, it is their capital, in Raqqa. And let me see. This is a church. Look, the Christian, even if Muslim Shia, Christian, and the Yazidis. Now, even for Sunni Muslim, although we have 11 women, they were sophisticated women. 3 of them were medical doctors because they didn't abide with their rules. So they killed him. They killed them. 2 of them were members of the parliament. The other, they were teachers because they didn't abide for their rules. That was their crimes. Those murderers. Now it is not only Iraq. In Nigeria, this young lady, she can tell you about Boko Haram, what they are doing in Nigeria, and what they did in Afghanistan. I think all the humanity know about that. But still there is, I hope that we can see that cage when they are burning people, eating the body organ. What kind of murderer is that? Look, yes, after this picture, after this. So this can tell you more than 10 lectures about what is going on daily basis in Iraq, on daily basis. The beginning of this month, there is agreement had been implemented between America, the leader of the free world, and I am proud to be also an American citizen. I became an American citizen recently. But I need them to follow the rules of the founding fathers. We have this new agreement which with Turkey in order to train a group of those murderers. One of them with those groups, the United Nations declared their name as a terrorist organization. But America said, no, they are not that terrorist, a little bit better than, I don't know, is there any better between terrorists? I cannot understand the foreign policy, although I all my life. I was, since 16 years old, I have to choose, because I faced all kind of discrimination, because I was living in Baghdad. I was born in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. I was from the wrong race as a Kurd, you know, and so I faced a lot of, and I paid, me and my family, a tremendous prices for that. And but that's the reason, until last day in my life, I have to help others, not only because they are Iraqis, anywhere in the world, because we came from, you know, from all these graveyards. We survived. So we need others not to see what, or suffer what we suffer. We need them to live. We are living only one life. Why should all these atrocities, all these, you know, agonies? Oh, why? Why? Because for who is paying the tremendous prices? It is those civilian. I hope you look at that little kid when he was looking at others. He didn't know that what they are preparing for him to be burned. He was just brought his two arms outside the bar of that cage and looking at it, what little one. And the others also, it is about maybe not more than 10. The older one among them, and it is here, you can show them, let them see that. Because we are here to talk. I am talking to you from my heart, even without any note in front of me. I am sure no one of you want this thing happen to anyone, not only to you, to anyone. We all are human beings, equal human beings. Is this acceptable to be happened after 20 years after the Beijing Declaration and platform for action and the UN initiative for full and equal rights for women to participate in all aspects and of the life, especially as a lawmaker or as a decision maker in her country. And look the situation, whether it is in Iraq or in Iran or in Middle East. Instead of women in this year, especially in this year, should celebrate 20 years after Beijing, the situation. It is, seems to me, this is much more a funeral march than a victory parade. Yes.
Zakia, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. I think that we can make an announcement for the people who are interested about your event that you're going to be holding tomorrow. Hold on a minute.
I hope you may come to our event, because I will show, maybe there is some what shall I say, will restrict her freedom to show you all the pictures. But in our event, I invited 2 or 3 ambassadors will come and will be there. Please, you may come in our event, which is tomorrow.
Tomorrow at the church center
near
the UN.
The chapel.
At 4:30.
We will show you the pictures. I need you to see that this young girl, I think it is not more than 14 years old. They naked her both hands behind her. It is here. Please, you may show them. Please, my dear. Do you want her to show you that? Yes, it is very harmful, break heart.
I think if you want to see these pictures, you can go to the event tomorrow at the church center. But I will tell you that in addition to the pictures that we've shown you, there were pictures that the Zakia gave me that were extremely disturbing and graphic about mass murdering of people by terrorists, beheadings of various people, including, as she just mentioned, a young woman, about women being held in cages, about men making derogatory remarks about which women they're going to buy and why, about the picture she just mentioned about children being burned alive. There are many very graphic pictures about what is going on over there, and I believe she's going to show them at the church tomorrow. I think that the association thought that perhaps putting them on our website might not be a good idea.
My dear, I know the world is actually became a small village. So if you will not see those little kids while they were burned them, I think all of you saw what they did for that pilot, Jordanian pilot, how they burned him alive. I think all of you saw that. I think most of you saw that, who opened the chest of the soldier and took his heart and eat it. And they are eating body organ, with no, they are, I don't know what kind of people they are. They are, and you saw how they sold women. And this, which Beijing, which international day we had on the 8th of March, look what's going on in Middle East for women. What? Who is women? They treat them as they are nothing for no any wrongdoing, just because they are either Yazidi or Kurd or Shia or Christian. You looked what they did with that church. What the Christian, what kind of harm or wrongdoing they did against them? Nothing. That's it. And then after that, they turned to our civilization. In all Iraq, we have 3 main cities, ancient cities. Some of them more than 3,000 BC, years BC. Can you imagine? It's a city. You can go inside the streets and look at the remaining of the, other remaining, but you can even see the streets and go inside. You can see the picture of Hadar. An archaeologist, a couple days ago, I saw him in Iraqi TV. He was about to cry. He said, I called the UNESCO in Paris. I called people, I know them in the United Nations. I begged them, please, Hatra is located in the desert, far away from Mosul, for about 2 hours, so which cost them about 2 hours to leave Mosul, going toward Hatra with their bulldozers and convoys and shuffles. So please, this place, it is no-fly zone for Iraqi air raid. So it is only the Allied Air Forces is working there. Please, you may bombarding them in order not to destroy Al-Hatra. But he said, they told me, yes, we will do all. Look at Hatra, look at Hatra. Look, how this beautiful city, now there is nothing. They are enemy of all kind of civilization. They are, leave aside the civilization. They are enemy of a human being. They are human. Sorry, my dear, I talk too much.
No. We're very interested in hearing.
I arrived. Sorry for that.
We will be asking you
God
some
bless
very
you
specific
all.
questions in a few minutes.
Yes, I am ready for any question.
Good.
Here
Thank
or there,
you.
doesn't matter.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear.
As long as we are on the subject of Iraq, I'll ask Carole to be the next speaker and to give her synopsis of what she thinks is going on.
Well, it's really hard to follow somebody as eloquent as Zakia Hakki. And yes, there was an attempt to assassinate her. And the reason that her legs are so bad is when she pushed herself out of the car, she fell headfirst like that on her knees. She was kind enough to really watch over me, so I just wanted to tell you what a brave person. She's really quite an amazing person. Now, what's the situation in Iraq? it's a desperate situation, and I see it happening throughout the Middle East. And then we look to Africa and Nigeria, and it's heartbreaking. We have to be honest and say that what's happening is a kind of ethnic cleansing. It's an ethnic cleansing of all the people who are not like you. So this runs in the face of everything that I know of religion, everything that I know of civilization. I'm not just talking about Western civilization, I'm talking about civilization. I really believe that we were all made in the image of God, or whatever that divine being is for each of us. And so it's a sacrilege to me that this could be going on. I have written and talked extensively about the ethnic cleansing of the Jews from Arab countries. We originally had 850,000 to 1 million Jews living in Arab countries. The million is from the Arab League estimate, by the way. And now there are less than 4,300 Jews left in all of the Arab countries. Many of these countries had hundreds of thousands of Jews in them and now have no Jews left. In particular, Iraq had about 150,000 Jews. Some say that, according to Eli Khadouri, the historian, that 40% of Baghdad was Jewish in 1948. Now we have left in all of Iraq 5 Jews. The nature of ethnic cleansing is not only that the people don't exist there, but that they left because of human rights violations. And so what I've gone about is chronicling those violations, because I didn't understand why my family would leave a place that they had lived for 2,600 years. And my family traces itself back to the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first temple. So if you add 586 BCE to 2014, you get 2,600 years. The end of that period exactly, 5 Jews left. I started looking into this to try to find out what was happening in my family, and I found out about the beginning of this ethnic cleansing that's culminating in ISIS. So let me tell you that story in brief. That story begins first with looking at 1933, when the Nazi ambassadors were brought to Iraq and to all the other Arab countries, and they translated Mein Kampf into Arabic. They brought radio stations and newspapers to publicize what they did. Of course, they couldn't call the Arabs Aryans. Wouldn't work. They were supposed to be the servant class of the Aryans. So they took that out and published the book. As I looked into this history, I found out there was even earlier massacres, but they weren't Jewish. There was, in fact, a massacre of the Assyrian Christians the year before in 1933, and predating that was the Armenian massacre. Now, the Armenian massacre killed 1.5 million people, and in the period just between 1 week in April 1915, there were 500,000 Armenian Christians killed. And that was done under the Ottoman Empire, unfortunately. And one of the lieutenants in the brigades leading the massacre was the Mufti of Jerusalem. Just so everybody knows, it goes back that far. And it goes back even further if you start to talk about the Dhimmitude, which institutionalized keeping Jews and Christians as a protected class under the Edict of Omer. That happened in about 732. And what that meant for people that weren't Muslim, when it was taken and distorted, was what we had with the Mongols in India. If you didn't convert, you were killed. If you were a people of the book, which means the Old Testament, the New Testament, then you could pay a tax or become a Muslim. And what we see playing out now, unfortunately, is this whole scheme of either not even obeying a protected class, because some of the Christians, as you've said, some of the Christians have been taken into slavery, have not been allowed to pay the jizya, the special tax on this supposed protected class, and have been sent to the slave markets and seen all of their kin killed. So even that hasn't been enough. I am sickened by what I'm seeing, as I'm sure you all are, and there's even more. History is being stolen from the Middle East when you see the destruction of these cities. But even worse than that is the destruction of the human understanding and human caring. Once you start to see slaughter, it continues. So I told you about the Armenian massacre, which there was then a massacre of at least 1,000 Assyrian Christians in Iraq in 1933. Then they started the anti-Jewish laws in 34, 35, and 36, which limited travel for Jews. Then it limited attendance in secondary schools and university, and then it said you had to have a Muslim partner in your business. By 1939, there was a pro-Nazi school curriculum in the schools in Iraq, all of them, including Jewish schools. And by 1941, there was a pro-Nazi uprising in Iraq that many people don't know about. And there was a slaughter of Jews in June 1st and 2nd, 1941, where they killed hundreds of Jews and stole property. There were many Muslims, in fact, I documented in my film, who saved many of their Jewish neighbors, so I don't want you to think this is about Muslim or Christian or Jewish. It's about good people versus not good people. And what went on from there after the pro-Nazi uprising was a period of quiet, and then 1948. During 1948, 49, 50, and 51, Jews were not allowed to work in Iraq. They closed the bank accounts, and they killed Jews in front of their homes. And so you start to see this, and then by 1951-52, anti-Jewish legislation said that any Jew that gave up their passport to be able to leave would lose their nationality. So you could leave, but you had to give up your passport. And then in 52, there was a freezing of all Jewish assets of the Jews who had decided to leave. Now, at the time, it was felt a tragedy, but looking back in retrospect, 90% of the Jews left at that time, and only about 10,000 Jews, so it's less than 10%, out of the 150,000 Jews remained. The ones who didn't leave by airlift in a 9-month period left through Kurdistan. And now Kurdistan is acting as a group that is protecting any of the Christians and Yazidis and even Mandaeans who are coming. They're staying there in refugee camps. And it's very hard for the Kurds, but this continues exactly. It's like we're playing out exactly what happened before here. As time went on, there were hangings of Jews in public squares in 1969, and then when it looked so bad to the world that they were hanging Jews because other Arabs complained, 1/4 of all the Jewish males were slaughtered, and some were given back in sacks cut up. I could go on and on with the human rights violations, but every one that I'm talking about is now being replayed. Interestingly enough, it's just an article was just written about a Jewish girl who disappeared in 1952 during this time. She came forward to some of the American soldiers in 2009, and they just talked about her story in the press. She was reunited with her mother, with her brothers and sisters. Her parents were no longer alive. She had lived as a slave in a Muslim home all of these years in Iraq. My own cousin, Mir Basri, who's a very well-known Iraqi poet, was hidden during the late 60s and early 70s for 3 years because they were scared she was going to be kidnapped and they'd never see her again. So what we're seeing here is a continuation. Under Saddam Hussein, they found over 1,000 heads of women that were put on stakes. Why were those heads put on stakes? Because Saddam Hussein in 1998, according to Human Rights Watch and according to the State Department in the United States, had an official rapist raping women. Then they would be killed and their heads would be given back to their families to be put on a pole with the words prostitute or adulteress, whether they were married or whether they hadn't married yet. When we went there, we worked on, with the Alliance, the Women's Alliance for Democratic Iraq on Saddam's trial, and we found that he continually used this tool. We found one rapist who had over 2,000 rapes that he had documented. So when we think that this is something in isolation, what we're seeing now with ISIS, it's a continuation of this, unfortunately, Nazi legacy. Saddam Hussein called it a National Socialist Republic. Hafez al-Assad had a National Socialist Republic, and so did Nasser. And all those National Socialist republics wanted to unite in the 1970s, in the late 70s, to create the United Arab Republic, which was going to be a National Socialist Republic, and united. It actually did for a couple of years. So this legacy is a continuing legacy that finds this doctrine that has mixed up, unfortunately, with Muslim Brotherhood from the time of Al-Bania in the early 1920s, going on with the Mufti of Jerusalem, who also happened to have escaped to Iraq in 1939 and led the pro-Nazi uprising, and then was in charge of the Far'ud. The Far'ud was supposed to culminate in concentration camps, and now we've just seen the fruition with ISIS. I could go into more detail. I've written a law review article about much of this that appeared in Fordham International Law Review. It's quite startling, the ethnic cleansing going on. And all I can say is, we didn't stop with the Nazis. It is continuing right now, and the form it's taking is Boko Haram, it's taking ISIS, it's taking a lot of horrible places, and we have to understand it for what it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Carole. Thank you, Carole. So you have two different perspectives of what's going on in Iraq right now. We're going to be asking a lot of more specific questions later on, but we want to go and give a chance to some of the other speakers to speak about other areas of the world. I don't know who to choose next. Why don't we go to what's going on in Afghanistan, because it parallels quite a bit what's been going on in Iraq.
Hi, everyone. So Afghanistan started with that. As you all know, pre-9/11, the Taliban were in power, and they were doing sort of the same things as what's happening in Iraq right now with ISIS and all that. And then 9/11 happened, and the U.S. went to Afghanistan. The Afghans were obviously ready. I mean, Afghanistan has gone through war since 1978. And when 2001 happened, Afghans had enough of war. They were ready for peace. And from 2001 until now, obviously with the help of the US government and other international governments, a lot of work has been done. Before 2001, Afghanistan was a blank slate with nothing, no school systems, no judicial system, nothing. They were just the Taliban roaming around and slaughtering women and making men grow beards and forcing them to pray. So since then, a lot of work has been done. Afghanistan, there are millions of girls in school. We have a judicial system that still needs work. It's only been 12 or 13 years since the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. So, we can't build a whole country in 12 or 13 years. But from what has been done, a lot of work has been done, a lot of progress has been done. We operate legal aid centers and shelters for women across the country. We are now in 13 provinces and soon expanding to 3 other provinces. We are welcomed by the community. Violence against women is still a huge issue in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but the community, the local communities welcome us. They realize that change has to happen. But Afghanistan right now is in transition, as you all know. The U.S. troops are leaving, NATO's leaving, and we're in a phase where progress could go on if focus stays on Afghanistan, or ISIS, who's in Iraq, is trying to set up shop in Afghanistan, and ISIS can come and take over. So we're in a tricky situation. The US troops are starting to leave. We hope that the Obama administration will reverse their decision to take out all the troops, because we need this transition to be gradual so that there's no power vacuum, that ISIS or other fundamentalists don't come and take over when the US troops leave. Afghanistan has a strong army. We still over 200,000 strong, but it's a young army, and we need training and equipment. And I'm very optimistic that Afghanistan is not going to go the route that Iraq or Syria is going, because Afghans don't want that. They don't want ISIS or the Taliban to come back to power. There are some places in the country where ISIS people have seen the flag of, that black flag, and locals have fought them off, because they really don't want that to happen again. We don't want history to repeat itself. So my plea to the international community is, it's only been 12 or 13 years. Afghanistan is a success story. Afghanistan is doing better than all of the countries, the Arab Spring, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq. Afghanistan is doing better than all of them. And the U.S. wanted to, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it was with the intention to bring democracy to an Islamic country. And democracy is happening in Afghanistan, and it's a success story. Last April, millions of people came out to vote. We had an election, presidential election, and the Taliban had told people, if you go out and vote, we're going to cut off your hands. But people went out and voted in the north, in the south, in the east, women, men, old, young, they all went out and voted. There was a man who had voted in the 2009 elections, and the Taliban were strong in his district, so the Taliban found out that he had voted, so they came and cut off one of his fingers, and last April he went and voted again with his other finger, because he said the Taliban will not stop him from voting. Democracy is flourishing in Afghanistan, and I really hope that the international community doesn't forget Afghanistan, and I'm hoping for progress that will keep going on. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we are in that part of the world, so I think we'll stick to that part of the world and talk about what is going on in Iran.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for putting this important panel together. And I think this is the first day in New York where we're not covered in snow, so thank you to the audience for showing up. I appreciate that. So the situation of Iran is a bit different than perhaps the other country situations on this panel, in that it isn't a country that's been racked by civil conflict for decades or has a problem of militant extremists inside the country, like we're seeing with these other country situations. But what is concerning for me is that, first of all, we have a very discriminatory legal framework, and it is enforced. It's a gender discriminatory legal framework, and it is enforced in ways that go beyond even the discrimination that is enshrined in the law to really discriminate against women. We were, as a community, as a human rights community, we were quite hopeful when the current president, President Hassan Rouhani, was elected in June 2013, because he had campaigned on a platform of gender equality. He had spoken about a lot of civil and political reforms that he would undertake, and he made a few bold moves in the beginning of his tenure by appointing a vice president of women and family affairs who's a female, and she was just speaking earlier today here in New York. And there was a lot of rhetoric about improving women's situation in the country. Unfortunately now, more than a year and a half later, we haven't seen any of that kind of progress that we were expecting, and the kinds of benchmarks that have been set by the United Nations and that have been discussed by Iranian civil society themselves and the women's movement inside the country. We really haven't seen a lot of that. And I think what is even more concerning is that this past November, October and November, there was a series of acid attacks, beginning in the city of Isfahan and then in other cities inside the country. And the acid attacks did not take the form of a spurned lover or a spurned suitor who had asked, a hand in marriage of a woman and had been rebuffed and then decided to retaliate. These were unknown male assailants flinging acid in public places at women who were driving cars and who were in public squares. And what came out afterwards, and it's never been confirmed, of course, but there's strong suggestion that this was actually linked to some kind of action from the Iranian authorities, and that's why there was no rigorous follow-up in terms of investigation. They still have yet to arrest the perpetrators of what is estimated to be 14 different attacks that happened in a very short space of time. And I've brought for all of you who are interested this report, Vigilante Violence, the Acid Attacks Against Women in Iran and the State's Assault on Women's Rights, that my group just released on right before International Women's Day, just this past week, and I put copies over there on the table. And in this, basically the thesis of the report is that the acid attacks did not occur in a vacuum. We strongly believe that the reason that we're seeing this pretty unprecedented spate of attacks in Iran, I mean, we don't really have a history of there's been acid attacks certainly in the past, but it's not something that's by any means endemic. So this was a big shock for the community there and for women and men. But our thesis is really that there's been a series of legislation, different bills that have been pending in Parliament over the past 18 months or so that encourage vigilante violence against women, essentially, to enforce Islamic norms of conduct, behavior, and dress. This is a very concerning trend that we're seeing. Unfortunately, Iran has had a very vibrant women's rights movement that began at the turn of the last century. So it's a long-standing movement, but after the disputed presidential election in the country in June 2009 and these sort of crackdown on civil society that followed, a lot of that movement has been dismantled. And so a lot of the women's leaders are now operating outside of the country, and it makes it more difficult to push forward progress on these issues and ensure that we don't see a downward trend in women's rights. So I'm not going to go on and on. I'll try to keep it brief, but I do encourage you to read the report. And the reason that I think, because obviously we're doing a lot of work with our domestic partners and trying to ensure that there is some reporting in the media of this, because essentially once newspapers started reporting about the acid attacks, some of those journalists were actually arrested, and the editor of a paper that broke the news was briefly detained. So there was a real state effort to try to ensure that there was no investigation of this and no independent reporting. And there's something called the Plan to Promote Virtue and Prevent Vice, which we go into detail about in the report, that's pending in Parliament. And this is what's calling for this sort of violent, essentially calling for a violent monitoring of women and their conduct. But the reason that I think it's important to address all of you is because, depending on your area of practice, I know there's a lot of lawyers in the room, or perhaps everybody is a lawyer, is a practicing lawyer. Right now, Iran and the P5+1 are going to seal the deal, hopefully, on these ongoing negotiations about the nuclear issue. And certainly all of us in civil society are really hoping for a deal, because we think that with a deal, there will be room for some kind of progress on the human rights track inside the country. We think that with no deal, the odds aren't looking so good, but at least with a deal, there will be some space for that. And once that deal is signed, I mean, to me, Iran is one of the last pieces of red meat, so to speak, in the international financial system. It had gotten de-swifted It wasn't allowed to be part of the SWIFT banking system, and there's been this, enormous, rigorous program of sanctions on the country for some time now. And there hasn't been a lot of business, obviously, with the West. There's been some business with European countries, but, in terms of U.S. investment, that's been next to minimal to nothing because of the sanctions program. So once that deal is signed, there might be an opening. And I think that we'll be seeing, kind of like a gold rush almost, with companies going to Iran and seeking to invest and looking to make money. And that can be a great thing for the country, but what's really important is to not lose sight of the human rights violations and ensure that that increase in business investment, in that kind of interaction is also socially responsible. And I know that, a lot of, maybe some of you are involved in those areas of practice or not, but a lot of our colleagues will be. And I want to impress upon them the importance in making sure that, if you're going to represent a telecom company and they're going to be engaging in contracts with the country, make sure that those services are not being used to monitor conversations between activists and then take that content and then round them up and engage in traditional forms of repression against these actors on the basis of that content. Or if you're going to engage with labor in the country, Iran has huge labor union issues, and every week there's a report of series of strikes and factories being set afire because workers aren't getting their wages and so on, to just make sure that while we move forward on this increased engagement and with Iran coming out of the cold and coming out of this isolation that it's been under in the international community, that's done in a socially responsible way, and that we don't lose sight of the fact that the Iranian state has been a chronic abuser of human rights, and that's why we have 2 UN human rights resolutions, one at the General Assembly each year and one at the Human Rights Council, addressing those issues. We need to do this in a socially responsible fashion, and that's why I think it's really important to speak to the international community, not just about getting involved in things like the CSW and ensuring that Iran complies with UN conventions and along those tracks, but also on that financial piece, that we move forward in a responsible fashion.
Thank you, Gissou. Well, now we're going to turn to another part of the world, Africa, where there are similarities and some differences. And we'll speak with Yvonne about what is going on in Nigeria.
Wow, there's just so much happening around the world that it's almost depressing in some ways, like after you hear all of this. But I think one of the most amazing things about activists and advocates is that there's always a part of us that's very hopeful that things are going to be different. And that's why we're crazy enough to continue to do what we do. Nigeria is a country in West Africa that's been through so much already. I think part of the irony is that our current government has the largest number of women in government, from 10% that it was back in 2010 now to about 33% of women in government. But unfortunately, that hasn't really translated to change in the quality of life for the average Nigerian woman. So we still have the second highest maternal mortality rate in the world. A woman dies every 15 minutes in childbirth in Nigeria. It's even worse in the northern part of Nigeria, where it's more rural and they have less access to hospitals. We also have approximately 67% of our women are illiterate. So there's a huge issue with girl-child education that needs to be addressed. Human trafficking is also another one of our big problems. And I know this, the panel's about extremism, but to me, these are definitely additional forms in addition to terrorism, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I believe most of the women that are trafficked outside of Nigeria to work in the sex industry are actually trafficked from Nigeria. About 60% of the women in Italy and Belgium are from Nigeria, and of that number, about 80% are from my home state, which is Edo State in Nigeria. There's also a huge issue with child marriage, which is permitted by various religious and traditional values in Nigeria. And even though we have a Child's Right Act that bans marriage for children under the age of 18, a lot of the states are being permitted to make the decision on whether they're going to adopt the law or not. And so you see a lot of children being forced into marriage before the age of 18 as soon as they reach maturity. So that you can have children as young as 9 years old that are being forced into marriage. Female genital mutilation is also another huge issue, even though that's actually quite, it's died down quite a bit, but it's a cultural practice that a lot of advocates in Nigeria are working on trying to eliminate. But I think our biggest issue, and which ties into what some of the other panelists have discussed, is the lack of national security that we've had recently with the insurgency of Boko Haram. So they're a group that came into power, that was formed in 2002, and a lot of it was actually a response to the abject poverty that they saw happening and the disparate differences between the haves and the have-nots. And so in some twisted way, there was a novel beginning to the madness, and it was to really address that particular issue of corruption in Nigeria. But then things sort of turned in 2009 when their leader was killed, and they began then to have more of an offensive and started attacking a lot of local businesses, and he started turning on Christians, on Muslims, and really started attacking a lot of the innocent people who had absolutely nothing to do with what the government was doing or what they alleged that the government was doing. And so most of you have probably heard, Boko Haram means Western education is forbidden, but it really focuses more on, the mandate, I suppose, is a lot broader than that. And again, they use religion as a basis for supporting a lot of the atrocities that they've committed throughout Nigeria. So far, there have been approximately 1.5 million people that have been displaced as a result of the insurgency, and over 13,000 people have been killed so far. It's estimated that of that number, there have been thousands that were killed earlier in the week that Paris had their attacks. But unfortunately, there was not as much media coverage of that atrocity, which took a lot of us, actually made a lot of us frustrated, because we value lives equally, and not just the lives that are in the West. But as a result of the insurgency, what we found is that a lot of women are getting raped, of course, because we know that women and children are the most vulnerable when it comes to war. And so, back in April of 2014, a lot of you probably heard about the almost 300 girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram from their schools. They were taken in the middle of the night. And those girls, believe it or not, have still not been returned. It's approaching almost a year later now. And we know that those girls, from the stories of the 56 of them that escaped, some of which I've spoken with, we know that they've been raped, they've been forced into marriages, all the things I think you can imagine can be done to children have been done to these girls. And the most recent fear, I think, now is that they're being utilized as suicide bombers, which started back in June of 2014. And so to date, there are approximately 30 girls so far, the youngest being as young as 7 years old, that was utilized as a suicide bomber. And so these are just some of the things that are happening in Nigeria. There's been, at least in my opinion, as one of the organizers of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, an utter lack of response, not just by the Nigerian government, but also by the international community. It's amazing to me that the world can sort of sit and watch what's happening in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in all these other places in Iran. It's all these things that are happening, and we can all just sort of sit and not really, be outraged at the fact that girls can be stolen from schools, that children can be killed, and that women can be raped, and we're just sort of all kind of sitting on our hands. And so I think that's where a lot of our passion comes from, is that we want people to realize that if it's happening in other places of the world, it's eventually going to happen here. Similar to the Ebola crisis. I think people thought when thousands of people were dying in West Africa, it really didn't make a difference, it didn't matter until it actually came to the steps of the U.S. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, Ebola, and everyone started focusing on it. But eventually, whatever happens anywhere else in the world is going to make its way here. And so it makes sense that we all sort of unite together to address it at the source of where it's happening before it actually gets here to the U.S. I think, overall, I'm very optimistic that things are going to turn around, and that's probably just the perpetual optimist in me that believes that things always will work out one way or the other. But there are a lot of things that are happening around the world that we hope that your presence here will amplify on our behalf. And so I'm just glad to be a part of the panel. Thank you.
As Afghanistan is concerned, we all know that there persists a lot of cultural problems for women. I'm going to call them cultural because very often the kind of problems that people attribute to religion are really not because of religious precepts at all. It's really because of cultural traditions. And one of them, for instance, is honor crimes and honor killings. Now, this is not just something that happens in Afghanistan. It happens throughout all of the countries we're talking about here. All of you have the same problem, honor crimes. Now, for those of you who don't know what an honor crime is, it means that a woman, a girl, who does something that defies the family in terms of either going out with a man she's not supposed to, or just going out freely without having an escort, or doing something that is considered improper. In order for the family to regain their honor, they very often have to kill the girl, or feel that they have to kill the girl. This is something that's not permitted under Sharia principles. I know that, under any of the Sharia principles that I've ever studied. And all the religious scholars that I know have confirmed that fact. It is a cultural tradition, and it persists, despite many efforts to eradicate it. So I would like all of you, to discuss how your countries are coping with this, and what you suggest as a way to handle the problem and to eradicate the practice. I'll start with Afghanistan.
Well, all of the problems that face women in Afghanistan is cultural. It has nothing to do with religion whatsoever. When it comes from honor killings to forced marriages to child marriage to, beating your wife or not letting them go to school, none of it has anything to do with religion. It's all cultural. As I said before, Afghanistan has gone through decades of war, and this is this is the result of it. Our culture has suffered as well. It has become a culture of war, and changing culture does not happen overnight. It takes generations to change culture. And in Afghanistan, we're trying to change culture one step at a time, one family at a time. And our family guidance centers, we're the biggest organization in Afghanistan dealing with violence against women. Since 2007, we've helped over 15,000 women through our shelters and legal aid centers. So when a woman comes to us with any problems that they may have with their families, and a lot of the time it's life and death issues. If she doesn't come to us, she's going to be killed by her family. We try to bring in the men to talk to them, to see what their side of the story is, how we can work with them to resolve the situation that they're in. For example, if a father is forcing his daughter to get married to someone she doesn't want, the father, doesn't know that forcing your daughter into a marriage is illegal in Islam. He thinks that he's the father, it's his God-given right, and he'll do it. Afghans are Muslims, but the Quran is in Arabic, so whatever Afghans know, they know from their, religious leader. So it's passed on like that. So there's a lot of misinterpretation of the Quran, And so when the father comes to us and says, and he says that, I'm the boss, I'm the father, God has given me this right, and I'm going to do as I please. So our caseworkers and our lawyers, our mediators, talk to this is just one example, to talk to him, make him understand that according to Islam, what he's doing is wrong. You know, in Islam, a girl has to agree to the marriage, and she has to say it in front of the mullah who's tying the marriage. She has to say, I agree to this marriage 3 times. And if she doesn't say it, that marriage is illegal. So most fathers are sending their daughters into an illegal marriage in Afghanistan, and they have no idea that they're doing this. Once we talk to him, sometimes we bring in religious leaders, sometimes we bring in community leaders to make him understand. And once he understands, you know, we're breaking that cycle in that family. Once he understands, from that point on, he doesn't force this daughter to get married, and then the other daughters in the family are safe, the granddaughters are safe, the nieces are safe. So we're changing culture one family at a time, and it's going to take a long time. Since 2007, we've worked with 15,000 families, so it's, you know, we're making a dent.
Gissou, is there an honor crime problem in Iran?
Actually, yeah, it's interesting to hear your comments on Afghanistan, because of course we're neighboring countries, but the situation is quite different in that in Iran currently it's actually not so much about culture, it is actually about religion. The religion that's being imposed by the state, because the state is theocratic, and we have a supreme leader who is, you know, the representative of Shia Islam on earth, essentially, in this Waliyat Faqih. So it is actually all driven by religion. And interestingly, culturally, that's not really the issue. And where we do have honor killings, a problem of honor killings, is actually in some of the provinces that, you know, we have a range of different ethnicities inside Iran, even though the state tries to play that down. So although there are Persians and Azeris in the majority of the country, we also have Arabs in the southwest, we have Baluch in the southeast, we have Kurds in our northwest, and in the Arab areas and in the Baluch areas, there is actually a big problem of honor killings. So if you look at the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, who gives his report to the Human Rights Council and also the General Assembly, the section on honor killings very much deals with those provinces. It wouldn't be a massive issue in Tehran, for instance, or any of the major cities. But alternatively, we have other problems that come from discriminatory laws that are enforced by the courts, that follow Sharia, and give penalties such as stoning for adultery, you know, that basically legislate moral offenses. And these moral offenses, the adjudication of it, normally crack down harder on women. So I would say this is much more something that's driven by the judiciary, it's driven by legislators in parliament who've come up with this discriminatory legislation that you can read about bit by bit. There's like 6 different bills that are pending, and it's less something that's driven by cultural practices. And in fact, a lot of the improvements that women saw in the last century up until 1979, because there were a lot of advancement forward, along with globally what was happening in terms of the women's movement, just a lot of that has been repealed in the past 36 years. So more a problem of the state and law and less a problem of culture, I'd say.
Can I just say something?
Yes, go ahead.
So, you know, I mean, I don't know Iran as much as you do, but in Afghanistan, people think that they know religion, you know, but they really don't. I suspect that that's the case in Iran as well. I don't think there's anything anywhere in the Shiite code that says, you know, that women should be stoned to death, or, you know, the governments have their own interpretations of the code, and most of them are very strict, conservative interpretations. When it comes to stoning, you know, women or men for adultery, it's very strict. I mean, it does say that in Sharia law, but it's almost impossible to enforce. In order to to sentence someone for stoning for having committed adultery, there has to be 4 eyewitnesses to the act of intercourse. Is that possible? I mean, how many cases can
I think that's a really important point. The point is that in Iran we have an Islamic penal code. That's what it's called. And so it's based on Sharia. But it is the Iranian code based on Sharia that mandates that punishment, for instance, that kind of sentencing. And in terms of the 4 witnesses requirement, that just gets into, you know, questions of due process and whether that law was actually followed in practice. But of course, you know, we have a serious due process problem. We have a massive problem in terms of witnesses, you know, credibility of evidence, just essentially, you know, some judges just like rubber stamping judgments, you know, lack of independence in the judiciary, intelligence ministry having influence. So whatever this toxic mix is, at least in Iran, it's a toxic mix of interpretation of Islam mixed with, you know, discretion of judges and a lot of loopholes that allow for just endless draconian interpretations. So,
speaking of draconian interpretations, are you telling me that the mullahs in Iran actually have come out condoning honor crimes?
So again, in Iran at least, we don't have this problem of honor killings to that degree that I would say, you know, maybe some other countries in the region have, where it's a serious problem. We do have it in some of the provinces. But if in this report, for example, we compiled statements from high-level clerics essentially calling for the Basij, which is a untrained volunteer paramilitary force, to enforce Islamic codes of conduct for women. And that's vague, ambiguous, very broad. So yeah, you do have an endorsement from high-level clerics of a lot of these kinds of practices.
All right, thank you. Let's turn away from honor crimes for a second to what's going on in Iraq. I've got a very interesting question. We've raised this issue of religion and the role of clerics now. I can't believe that there are a lot of clerics in the Islamic world who would condone the mass execution of innocent people and rape and forced slavery of women that's going on in Iraq. So I wonder, many of the people who have joined ISIS seem to have done so out of religious zeal, that they think they're going to, on a holy jihad, to go and establish a holy Muslim state. I would think that they would be particularly susceptible to influence by religious leaders saying, no, the practices they are doing over there are not in accordance with Islamic practices and principles. So where are the religious leaders in all of this? Why haven't they spoken out more vociferously about what's going on in Iraq? Or have they, and we just haven't heard about it? Zakia?
Me?
Yeah?
My dear, I am ready to answer any question. But this question should be directed to those religious leaders, especially the Sunni sector, the Wahhabis, you know, those are just like, as you know, I am specialized in Sharia. They are not Muslim, in my opinion, you know, because it is not Islam. It is not what God says in the Holy. It is not interpreter of people. But let me tell you about the same question you directed to my colleagues regarding the, you know, what Iraqi women have had. Actually, I submitted a report to the United Nations 2004. It was about the struggle of Iraqi women during 1 century. I promise I will send you a copy of that because it will give you by details. Women after the First World War in Iraq, we suffered, our grandmothers suffered from Ottoman Empire domination for more than 400 years. So it was everything background. What shall I say about that? You know, ignorance, it was even more than 99% among people. So in 1921, when the new Iraq monarchy had been established, at that time, of course, women, she couldn't go outside her home without one of her family escort her, because, you know, it was forbidden. Just like now what Taliban, they did in Afghanistan, and now what the ISIS wanted to do to Iraqi women. But believe it or not, within only 20 years, from 1921 until 1941, we have had the first female women who graduated from law school as a lawyer. Can you imagine this happened? We burned 400 years of background. Iraqi women, I am not actually, when I talk about that, I am not arrogant about that. I'm telling, because everything's documented, very well documented. At that time, 1932, we have the first woman who had a car and a driver's license, and she could drive her car in Baghdad. Until this moment, in Saudi Arabia, it is forbidden for women to drive a car. It is forbidden, a very great sin. She should go to jail for that. This is a terrorist. They call her as if she is a terrorist. If they found her behind the, oh, sorry. So after 20 years, we have had at that time not only that lady, Sabiha Sheikh Dawood, she was the first female who became a lawyer. We have had, during this 20 years, hundreds, then thousands of teachers. Female, I'm talking about female, not about male. We have doctors. Can you imagine, on 1949, until now in America, although we have, Lady Clinton, she nominated for last term to be president for the United States, but you didn't have here a mayor for Washington. In Iraq, 1949, we had a lady, her name is Suad Al-Amari. She was the first mayor of Baghdad. 1958, we have that revolution, 14 July revolution. After overthrow of the monarchy, the newly, even during the monarchy time, we have had the Article 6 of the Constitution that said all Iraqis, regardless of their different ethnic background or religion or sex or color, regardless of that, they are equal in the front of the law and within the law. Within the law. This is something that we have had at that time, equal salaries for men and women in the same job. While here, you don't have, not here, even in European countries. Just let me tell you why we feel not only sad but angry, because after all that achievements, after that revolution of 1958, 59, we have had the first minister in the Middle East, not only in Iraq. In the history of Iraq and Middle East, we have had, when the newly government of the revolution, 14 July, they announced Iraqis are equal, and you can. They have full.
Zakia, can I interrupt you just for a second? I just want you to. I need to ask you though. Are there any clerics that you know of who've come out against ISIS and what ISIS is doing in Iraq?
Well, yes. Now, of course, yes. All, I think, in Iraq especially, they are against Sunnis. They are against them, but still, from Saudi Arabia, from there it's originated this thought. It is from there, my dear. Then September 11, it is from there. It is from Saudi Arabia. Still, Saudi Arabia is paying, supporting by everything, arms, money, everything to those murderers.
Are there any clerics that are in Saudi Arabia who have been coming out in support of ISIS?
All our communities, whether in Iran or Afghanistan, as a Muslim communities, we have, of course, two kind of. We have just like those in the villagers, and so in the villages, maybe something happened, but in Iraq, no. After 1958 and 59, when we have the first family personal law. Not only Muslims, Christian, everyone in Iraq, they practice this law for their family. Believe it or not, although the Holy Quran said the man should have 2 shares and women 1 share, in our law, personal law, no, they are equal. They have equal. Even as I told you, our salaries, not now, since 1921 until now, if you have you graduated from law school or any and you go to have a job, and you have with you your brother the same thing, you will have with him the same salary. We don't have such a problem about salaries because of sex. No, we don't have it. Let me tell you, my dear, in America, since 1919, American women, they have the right, political rights. But 1995, we saw the first minister, which was Madeleine Albright. 1959, from 1919. While in Iraqis, believe it or not, maybe you just surprised for that. Believe me, my dear. This is the fact. I think Dr. Carole also knows about that. We have women as officers in the army, in the National Guard, since then. So all this, we have it, all this achievement. Now a group of those savage, they came with, let me say, we don't know who supported them. Let me say that, but it is very obvious they cannot come from where they have all this. Well, it is not now to talk about these things. But
all right, I will ask you another question then.
The first female judge after 1 year of that, the Iraqi Revolution, 1959.
Let me ask you just one very quick question.
Yeah.
All right, very quick question. Do you think it would be helpful to the situation in Iraq if the United States were to get more involved, either militarily or financially, in aiding the people there?
My dear, I think it is a moral duty of the United States. United States rescued our people from the most vicious regime in the world, who genocide Iraqis, my people. He used chemical weapons, biological weapons against Kurdish people. Not only Kurdish people, more than 5 million Iraqis just fled their countries. They came out just from that hell, so-called Iraq at that time. But they should continue that, not by supporting. We have our, as a member of the parliament, our House Speaker, he said something that, believe it or not, America has a loaded rifle in its hand. This loaded rifle is murderers and dictators like Saddam and others, and they brought those to power. So, and any time they want, they can point it to solve their problem. This is a very wild game and a very dangerous game. How can I bring a snake to my home? And who is Osama bin Laden? Who funded them? I think it is very well documented when Ms. Hillary Clinton talked about that openness in the TV. Everybody heard her, my dear. What shall I say about
All right.
it?
Yvonne, I'm going to ask you a similar question. You mentioned that part of the problem is that the Nigerian government hasn't cracked down enough on the Boko Haram organization. We've heard that there are all kinds of problems because Boko Haram goes into more than just Nigeria, and it can find hiding places in other countries, and then come back to inflict more casualties and problems in Nigeria. But what do you think the answer is? Do you think the answer is to have some military aid being given to the Nigerian government? Do you think the answer is to have some sort of political pressure put on that group? Training of people in the military in Nigeria? Education? What is the answer? Or is there no answer?
Oh, there's always an answer. I think it's a combination of different things. I think the first thing that I want to point out is that it's Nigeria's fight to lead. I mean, and we should be leading the fight. However, I think that there are a lot of things that historically, and you were alluding to this too, that imperialism has resulted in and has caused. And so as a result of that, there is some responsibility on the part of the international community that has led a lot of these Western imperialist movements to come to the aid of people who have been placed in a weakened state as a result of that. So right now, the African Union is leading the war against Boko Haram. So it's a combination of neighboring countries in Niger, Cameroon, and Chad that are also assisting Nigeria. And apparently, since the 6 weeks that the elections, which were supposed to have been held on February 14th, were postponed, they've made a lot of headway into eradicating Boko Haram from at least 36 of the strongholds where they had taken and declared a caliphate. So there is some progress being made on that front. But in addition to intelligence that's being provided by the West, I guess in some ways, as a Nigerian American English person, I can understand why the West may be hesitant in putting boots on the ground. But I do think that there should always be this willingness to come to the aid of people around the world, especially when you've been a part of creating the problem. So right now, intelligence apparently is sufficient, and that's what England and the U.S. has agreed to provide. And the African Union and coalition of countries surrounding Nigeria apparently are doing their best to eradicate this problem. But again, I do think that if it's necessary, the West should intervene, whether it's with military boots on the ground or whatever it's going to take, because like I said, I mean, I keep emphasizing that it's something that eventually is going to reach the United States, just like ISIS will as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Issa a question. Since so many of the problems that you have talked about in Iran are attributed to an interpretation of religious doctrine, I have spoken with a number of women from your country and other countries who have said that the only way to eradicate the problems is really to eradicate the religious doctrines that permeate the laws. And there are other women who say, no, what is necessary is to have a better interpretation of the religious principles rather than try to remove them entirely from the legal system. What is your take on this? Do you think the answer to the problems in Iran would be to try to make Iran a secular state and remove any reference to Sharia? Or do you think the better approach would be to try to have a more women-friendly and human rights-friendly interpretation of Sharia principles?
Well, that's a pretty heavy question because I think there's a lot of different views on this. Certainly if you're coming from a reformist Islam perspective, then you think that there is a possibility for having Islamic principles be a guiding force in legislation and a legal framework. Certainly not the code that we currently have. And so a lot of the recommendations from the international community as well as domestic civil society when it comes to reforming these laws deal with things like, you know, no death penalty for moral offenses, you know, have a woman's testimony be equal to that of a man, this sort of thing. So yeah, it would fundamentally change a lot of what religious scholars in the country believe is what, you know, their religion dictates. So I don't really know. I know that, you know, in terms of what we ask for as an organization and in terms of what a lot of Iranian human rights defenders ask for is these are the things that need to change, and whichever way to which we get to that point, you know, that's fine, as long as the end result is that those changes are implemented. So whereas some people might be calling for regime change or things that, you know, are more extreme, we're just asking for certain benchmarks to be met. And certainly I think if there's an approach taken whereby human rights are respected and equality for different religions is respected and that sort of thing, then maybe we can get there.
Thank you. I could ask probably another 2 or 3 hours worth of questions, but I think I would like to have some of the people in the audience ask questions and get your take. Does anyone here have a question that he or she would like to ask? No questions. Everyone is totally satisfied with the, you know all the answers. You don't have any questions whatsoever. Carole?
Well, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, a number of the people in ICs are former Ba'ath, high-level Ba'ath people, including the new elected caliph, who was in jail and was part of that whole Ba'athi regime. So I want to just make that clarification. As for clerics, I know that a very interesting thing happened, which was Sistani, who's the chief cleric in Iraq, has asked Shiites to fight against ISIS and has tried to get that to stop. So you're talking about clerics. Also, El-Sisi, who took over from Muslim Brotherhood, which I pointed out started much of the ethnic cleansing throughout the world and also got involved with the Wahhabis. Azhar, he's asked the university there to create a kind of, in Cairo, to create a reformation so that they can talk about these issues. And so that there can be, among the Sunnis at least, because
But not from Saudi Arabia.
no, not, I'm saying from Egypt, from Cairo. But it is a very influential place in terms of clerical thought. I would hope that the Ayatollahs in Iran would also come to some conclusion in some of these areas, because I don't think it's just one area that needs reformation. I think it's the whole philosophy, because we've had Iran coming up with supporting Hezbollah, taking over Lebanon. And so there is something going on here. And it is it is different than what has happened in other religions, let's say, in terms of interpretive quality. The interpretive quality has been in terms, from what I understand, of taking Sharia, and you have individual interpretations of that. But this opening up to what's been happening culturally needs to have maybe some reinterpretation so that people find it more easy to resist the terrorist elements.
I should mention that there are actually some dissident Shia clerics in jail in Iran. So, it's, in a way, it's not as much about discussing different types of thought, because in the Shia practice, you can have, you have your marjas, like we just talked about Sistani, like your sources of emulation. There is a robust discussion of interpretation and how different things should be applied. However, sometimes when there have been clerics that have had a view that's different from, let's say, state authorities, basically, they've been penalized for it. And so sometimes people are surprised to hear that some of the clerics themselves are under house arrest or in jail because they had a different view. So, one thing I also mention is that a lot of our colleagues who are deeply religious, many of them have been turned away from religion because of the state enforcement of it, of their version. So in a way, it becomes, if you want to have your freedom of thought and if you want to be open to looking at different interpretations and so on, sometimes there's a very heavy price to pay, and that really discourages that kind of discussion. So that's the closed climate we're dealing with right now, in Iran at least.
And just to mention, I believe Sistani never supported the Iranian Revolution. And one of his things was that he didn't want to become part of a government, the Shiites. He wanted that religion should be separate, and he stood by that while I was in Iraq and now, and I've watched the situation, and he could have become the leader of Iraq. He chose not to do that for that very reason, and I've always respected him for that, though in retrospect, maybe if he had, it would have been a calmer place.
Well, I will just ask one final question. I think that from the discussion we've had today, the root of a lot of these problems seems to be interpretations of religion or cultural traditions that are ingrained in the society. And one of the ways in which these types of principles can be addressed and perhaps changed would be through education. But I wonder whether education is really going to do the trick, and if so, who needs to be educated in order to have events change? I was wondering if each one of you can just sort of tell us, what do you think would be the way to improve the situation in your country? Is it through more education? Is it through external pressure by the United States, the United Nations, other organizations? Is it through pressure that women's groups can bring, if they have any power whatsoever in your country to do that kind of a thing? What do you see as the way forward? What would you recommend as the steps forward, each one? And we can start with Carole, because Carole is the first one there.
It's difficult to say how things should go forward. I was so hopeful about Iraq when I was there that things would be different and it would be a very open society, and that everyone had learned from the tragedy of Saddam Hussein and his regime. So I really think that it's humanity that we've got to look toward, and I think that what I spoke about religious leaders and moderate Muslims coming out and speaking, whether they're Shiite or Sunni, about what should happen is the most important thing. We don't provide them with an opportunity and a forum to talk about what's right, and they feel that they're endangered by radical elements, they won't have a forum to make that change. It's very hard to impose that forum on anyone outside of the religion, quite frankly. So I just have to leave it there. I don't think I can oppose attitudes when those attitudes need to be developed by the people in the region. We've tried that already. And it makes me sad. I wish I could say I had the magic answer. But there's no magic answer except going back and looking at that we are all creations of a divine being if you're religious, and if you're secular, you believe in ethical duties, and that the kinds of things that Zakia showed us should just never, ever happen to any human being.
Actually, I agree with my dear Carole regarding it is not a matter what's happening in all our societies. It is not a matter of the religion. No. The main resource of all religions is God. If there is any differences, it is we human beings who created. So it is a tribal, especially in like Afghanistan, still tribes, they have their own power. While in Iraq, we have had a law which abolished the tribal law since because there is the fact that there is tribes during the Ottoman Empire 400 years, there were no government, central government. So who was, defend people? If I don't have a tribe, I will go to a great tribal leader, and I ask him to accept me as a member in his tribe. So this way, they protected themselves during that 400 years. Well, after that, when a new government had been established, whether in Iraq, in Iran, and after the First World War, and everything had been also, developed, still the tribes, they have had their own influence on the political life, especially the social life. So it is just like a community of men, what the men wanted to. So that was, it is not the principles of Islam. Islam is something which is between you and God, to be good with your family, with the community, not to do anything wrong. That's all religion, it is the same thing since we were the followers of Zoroaster. Before Islam, before Jewish, before Christianity, all these religions, it's same thing, to be good and to act good, to talk good. This is all religions share this. So if there is anything more which make women just nothing as a servant, that's the reason that we got mad. Those murderers want us to go back to the Stone Ages, to the Stone Ages. Believe me, that's what. But it is only on our dead bodies. Now Iraqis, they are fighting. Women and men, they are together. They are fighting those murderers. So, my dear, this is what shall I say? It needs, of course, in other societies, it needs themselves. They should. Unify their efforts and what shall I say? Just like invest any of these. There is in the religion, in the tribal, principle. They have some good principles. We can invest that also, just to protect the human rights for women. That's what we should do. And I think Afghanistan, they are doing well now, trying to, and we hope Iran also, but this kind of something, I don't, every community, they should talk about their, I have no right to evaluate the situation of Afghanistan or Iran, but for my country, yes, for Iraq, I can talk.
All right, thank you. Ilan?
I think when the Chibok girls were initially stolen from their school, there was a lot of outrage about child education, and that children everywhere should be entitled to be educated, and I think that's important. But for me, what I think the West to understand that this goes beyond the idea of whether the child can be educated or not. I think it permeates into this sort of antiquated thinking that women have less value than men, and so they can be carted off in the middle of the night and sold, and their bodies done with as men please. I think it's that sort of thinking that really needs to be eradicated. So because it may be education today, tomorrow it'll be unequal pay, it'll be doors that are slammed in the faces of women as they try to enter into politics. So from my perspective, a lot of the education, if that is the solution, needs to be focused on the way that men view women, the way that men value women. So there needs to be a sort of community transformation in that. And so I think a lot of the focus needs to be on really getting men to see women as equal bearers of the image of God, or whatever you believe. But I think that's really where it has to start. It goes way beyond the idea that it's just simply what's appearing on the surface.
So actually, education was one of, I would say, the largest achievements of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So in fact, up till recently, there was more women in higher education than men, and there's very high rates of literacy in Iran. So the issue is not so much just on access to education, because in fact, the events of 1979 helped that, in the sense that a lot of people in the provinces did not have access to education prior to that, and now they do. So the country enjoys high rates of literacy, and that has really caused a problem in a sense, because a lot of people are quite aware of their rights. It's just that it's an extremely harsh system, a very well-oiled system. It's not chaotic. It's actually quite organized and very draconian. So it's a bit of a difference in terms of what I think the way forward is in terms of progress. It's absolutely legal reforms. All of the human rights violations, the bulk of them are coming from the judiciary. The fact that Iran has the highest rate for several years in a row, had the highest per capita rate of executions, or the highest number of executions per capita. The fact that, prisoners of conscience are arrested for things like posting content on their Facebook page and getting sentences of 12 years, like very long terms of imprisonment. These come from untrained judges who play fast and loose with the law, don't apply it like they should. You have an intelligence ministry that is overbearing and is forcing judges, in some cases, to actually give death sentences for crimes, like one man who was sentenced on insulting the prophet, and it was because of content he put on his Facebook page. So I think our issue is really, the way we would see progress is through serious legal reform, and I know that there's a lot of international trainings conducted with people from the judiciary in Iran, and I think that's great. I think things like that are helpful to get them to be aware of what international standards are and what their obligations are according to the ICCPR and the other conventions that Iran is a signatory to. So that's the way forward, I think.
Well, I'll interject just before we finish up with Afghanistan. I think you've pointed out to various types of education here. We were talking about educating men in ways to view women so that they don't feel that they can take advantage of them in the way that they are doing in Nigeria. And we're talking about educating judges, and that's something close to my heart, because I've been working with the U.S. government on judicial training programs in the MENA region now for 11 years, which I agree is a very important type of program to continue and to focus on. But these are education issues. You're just agreeing that really a lot of the problem might be solved. I don't think you're ever going to solve the ISIS problem by education, because that's that's a political power-grabbing issue there. I don't think trying to educate their leaders is going to do you very much good there. But in some of these other areas, it may be productive. And in Afghanistan, I will let you conclude your remarks, but from what you've said earlier, educating people in the correct Sharia principles that should be applied, for instance, in honor killing type situations, seems to be something that you're doing already. So education may have some kind of role to play in Afghanistan as well. But I'll let you conclude to see what you say about it.
So in Afghanistan, change really has to come from within. We can't impose any kind of change from the outside. It has to come from civil society. It has to come from the people on the ground. And because of the decades of war that disturbed society in Afghanistan, literacy rates are really low in Afghanistan. We had like 3 decades of no education, none, no elementary, secondary, higher education, nothing for anyone. So we have 2 generations of uneducated people in Afghanistan. So education is, in Afghanistan, education is the way to go. Educate the girls, educate the boys, educate the men, educate the women. And alongside that, we have to put pressure on the government to bring reforms, to make sure that laws are implemented. There are laws on the books, but they need to be implemented. So education and legal reforms, side by side.
All right, well, I would love to stay longer, but we've really run out of time. I'm sorry none of you had any questions that you wanted to ask, but I hope that we answered any questions that you might have had in your mind. I'll take that as a positive sign that we have. And I want to thank you for coming to hear this panel discussion. And for those of you who want to spread the word, we have been recording it, and hopefully it will be on the association's website for the general public to have access to. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the panelists. It's been an extremely interesting discussion, and we've tried to cover a lot of ground in a very short period of time, so I apologize that we couldn't go into as much depth into the various questions that I would have wanted us to talk about as we would if we had 4 or 5 different hours to do it. But I think we covered a lot of ground, and I really thank you all for your attendance and your participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.